Hello and welcome to Poems On. This show is the 15th in the series. It's the fourth show of the second season. Our theme today is memory. And my guests are Rhina Espaillat and Anton Yakovlev. Rhina is a returning guest and Anton is new to the conversation. And without too much further delay, I'm going to ask Rhina to start us off by gracing us with something of hers.
Thank you very much, Al. It's a joy to be here for a second time. And such a wonderful theme, too. There is no end to what you can say about it. I'm going to begin with a poem that was inspired by a dream, something that happens very often. I'm sure I'm not the only one who does that, but I very often dream something that sends me back to the past immediately, and to enlarge upon it and to think thoughts about it that are new for me. And I enjoy that because it feels as if life were being gone over in a new way. It's called In That Old Dream Again, and the dream consisted of myself walking between my two parents in Central Park in the evening, which we did very often after dinner. And I always heard them talking above me, above my head, and I was busy swinging between them. In that old dream again, safe in the pool of twilight green gone black, that leafy shade remembered and unreal, we walked in cool night breath, fungal and minty. And they made above me, I was small again, a roof of their heard laughter, for I could not see, but sense them as a fact that needs no proof, being one of those givens meant to be, like summer and God's mercy. How I yearned, waking into their absence, to be there between them as they moved, and never turned toward me again across the changing air, as if the dark they chose were the true light, and morning dropped a veil across my sight. And it was a very sweet, a very happy dream, but there also is that melancholy at the end that comes when you wake up and you realize that the beloved people you've just seen alive again are not anymore, and that you're going to live with their absence as you have.
So when you, we all have dreams that connect us to our past, but we also use our memory while we're awake to recall events from the past. And what do you find is the qualitative difference between your consciously sitting down to remember walking with them in Central Park when you were young, and having it presented to you from inside of the theater, so to speak, as a dream?
Well, the theater is trying to make you relive something that you can never relive again. That's the difference. The difference is that it works, that when you dream something, you are there temporarily, if only slightly, if only for a little while, but you're there and you have the joy of this experience again, and the innocence not to know that it's false, because you think, well, this is happening again. Of course it is. It happens all the time. All we have to do is go out after dinner. And then you wake up and you say, no, that was not real. That was a pleasure that I kind of stole from reality.
Well, there are different realities.
Yes, there are. Well, it reminded me of your poems in a way, because your poems feature your parents so often and so lovingly, that I thought you must do this also sometimes.
Well, I don't dream about them so much, but I remember, I make conscious effort to put myself back into that space when I'm writing about them, because it makes me feel close to them. And maybe if I dreamed about them, I wouldn't feel a need to do that, but I do.
Well, it's good either way. It's good either way. Love works no matter how you approach it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I really love the line "Morning dropped the veil across my sight." The idea that the dream is more real than reality. And in a way, what's being obscured is your subconscious that is yielding up the dream. And now, as you
Yes.
come awake, it's like, in a
Yes.
way, you
Yes,
have
that's
less
right.
insight, less reality.
Yes, that notion of the veil is the difference, I think, that Al was looking for. Yeah.
Wow. Well, this is a good way to get us started. All the poems that I read of yours for today take a little bit of a different tack on memory, do they not? What are you planning on reading first, Anton?
Well, I was actually going to follow up, kind of play off of Rhina's poem a little bit and start with a poem called Eternity, which has to do with waking up and sort of memories that come in when the day hasn't started yet. It's an imagined character. I did not have. I'm an only child. It's not in any way autobiographical. So this poem is, imagining someone in this situation based on, more than one person really that I know. But essentially, it's almost like kind of the time when morning is dropping some kind of a veil, but it's not yet dropped. So this poem is called Eternity. Early on Sundays, while your home is still and you can hear the cardinals outside, you let your limbs relax into the chill left by your sister the day she died. Her coffee mug stands on the windowsill and stares at you with its unblinking eye. The handle is the eyelid. The pupil might be a spoon, some frost, or a hovering fly. Eventually, your husband will awake, reach for your shoulder, and the spell will break. The eye will fade. The treadmill will restart. You'll say, I love you, and climb out of bed, paying no mind to contrails overhead that cross the sky and sometimes come apart.
Thank you. One of the things that strikes me about this and following what Rhina's poem was doing is that the two realities, the other reality of waking up in bed it's even more, it's more personally fleshed out. It's one kind of intimate experience upon waking, immediately juxtaposed to the dream one, and so it makes me think of that transition a little bit differently. It gives me a fuller sense of where it's coming from and where it's coming into, because we have such a clear picture of the room and what's about to happen and how the day is beginning. So in terms of capturing these subtle and fleeting states of awareness, I really like how the point of attack on that.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing is also that he made a story out of it, that he created another character, a sister he doesn't have. That, in other words, it's really an analysis, not an event, but an analysis of the dreaming process, of the memory process, of the remembering process.
Did you have that in mind, Anton?
I mean, an analysis, I guess, it's interesting you use the word. I mean, I guess I was thinking, more of an imagining, a kind of envisioning, and, trying to inhabit someone's conscience. Because, I have experienced things like that, the idea of like looking at a coffee mug and it bringing some kind of memory, So even though it's not like specifically me having a sister, it is kind of like an experience that is familiar to me, which I then kind of abstracted a little bit, I think, and maybe tried to make more universal by kind of like not talking directly about myself, but having an experience, the kind of experience that I've had, that I frequently have actually, when it's like, I'm already awake, I react to the world, but it's not yet, I'm not really thinking about the world yet. And that something that is normally obscured comes in, almost like a dream. Yeah, something that you remember, something from like the life that is kind of in the treadmill, the metaphorical treadmill, or in the sort of hustle and bustle of the moment-to-moment responsibilities is easy to overlook, but it's there, kind of like in the background.
You certainly did
That's
create the eternity, the universality that you wanted.
It's convincing, yes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I have one question. I have one question. Could you
Shoot.
explain your title of Eternity?
Eternity, to me, was something that's always there. The state of, like, in eternity, in the permanence of things that are kind of behind the moment to moment, is the sister, her sister, the memory, the trauma, the grief. And so that is the thing, kind of like you're in touch with eternity when you're unencumbered by the moment to moment. And eternity in this case is the fact that she'll always remember her sister. She'll always have that kind of connection and awareness. She'll always be looking at her from eternity, from beyond the earth realm.
Beautiful poem.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, I have to follow it. What I have is a very short poem because it's an attempt to capture possibly my earliest memory. Certainly one of my earliest memories. And I've dated it from 1951, which would have been when I was 2.5 or so. And it's called How I Learned About Solitude. I'm in the kitchen on the 2nd floor. My mother has just left. I'm 3. I'm standing between the stove and kitchen table in the middle of the floor. I take 10 steps and climb up on the chair next to the window. I see my mother walk across the street below me. Then she disappears. I know there is a corner store 2 blocks away. First time now, I feel that I'm alone. First time now, I feel that she'll be back.
The two thoughts are antithetical, but they go together. Yeah. I love this poem.
Yeah.
That kind of security. Yeah.
Coming into awareness of sort of like the sense of what alone means and what not being alone means. And also kind of beginning to think temporarily, realizing, kind of like calculating that, from the fact that she's 2 blocks away, maybe from having previously experienced this and now coming into consciousness that she will be back, kind of like beginning to see, almost like beginning to have a sense of time, a sense of expectation and of progression of things, kind of for the first time in a conscious way, which is, I think, is fascinating.
Well, thank you. I've thought about it.
It's a kind of self-comforting. It's a kind of self-comforting now.
Yeah. I've thought about it, and I thought, why wasn't I anxious? Mm-hmm. Because it would certainly be a perfectly understandable emotion to have when you see your mother walking away and disappearing. But after I think about it some more, it occurs to me that I didn't um, I only knew trust. I had never, my trust in the world had not yet been disrupted. Nothing had ever happened to me to make me mistrust the future. I was with my parents and everything was fine. So I wasn't afraid. Obviously, that didn't last for a very long time. But it's nice, as you say, Rhina, it is self-comforting. And it's nice to realize that that is where, that must have been where I was before I had that realization, was everything is all right. I mean, there's a certainly spurious anecdote about Einstein as a child. Does anybody know this anecdote about how Einstein was a late speaker, that he didn't speak until he was past the age when children are supposed to speak? And he was supposedly, he's sitting at the dinner table with his parents, and all of a sudden he looks up and says, "This soup is cold." Mm-hmm. And they say, "What?" He says, "The soup is cold." They say, "But you can talk." He said, "Certainly I can talk." They said, "But you've never said anything before." And he said, "Up until now, everything has been in order."
I knew that one.
Yeah. Up until now, there was nothing to say.
Nothing to say.
Right.
Nothing to complain about. Never mind.
Right. So anyway, thank you for your reactions. It literally is my first memory, so I'm glad it's a good one. Well, we go to round two. What have you for us, Rhina?
Well, I'd like to read a poem that is sort of the opposite of what you've just read. This is called Crayons, and it's an immigrant memory. And I had been, well, my parents were political exiles, as you both know. Mm-hmm. And I had spent 2 years with my grandmother in the Dominican Republic while my parents were trying to make their way, having been exiled in Washington, D.C. as representatives of the Dominican Republic, because they disagreed with something that the dictator did. He had committed a lot of murders against the Haitians on the border of our countries, our two countries that border. And my great uncle said, I can't work for a government like this. So of course they were exiled, and I went back to my grandmother's house, and I spent 2 years without them there. But eventually, of course, they had an apartment and work to do and jobs and so forth, and they sent for me. And one of my earliest memories from that second visit to the United States is being in PS 94, where Miss Conroy was the teacher. And this is called Crayons, and it's a real story. When the child learning English joined your class, you gave her crayons, a whole box to keep, and said, "Now draw me something you remember." Windows were trimmed, it was early November, with toothy pumpkins. What your student drew, though, was her narrative, figures afloat on spikes of parrot green meant to be grass, waved out to one lone figure on a boat, tilting precarious in a royal of blue meant to be sky and sea, both very deep. The next day, Miss Conroy, you unrolled, laid out, and tacked up on the bare back wall 8 yards of oak tag. From the far left end, each artist classmate worked to illustrate the nation's past. History would unfold there every morning, early every day, until we reached our time, then almost lean into a future more desire than seen, you wanted, no, assigned us to create. First, Pilgrim's Landing, done in shades of gray, weather, weapons, clothes, the rock itself, all equally severe. Then, to befriend those somber strangers, others, bravely red and brightly feathered, above words you said to print in colors. Welcome and homestead, sowing and harvest, hunting, hut, and fish. In memory, the scripted scenes are clear. Arrows in flight pass safely overhead, missing the settler, bringing down the deer. Crops in the field rendered in tan and gold to feed the worker, farmer, soldier, priest. Nobody dies except the very old. Even the smiling turkey on its dish wears a corsage of carrots to the feast. What simple tales we learned early from you, who may well have believed them, though your own immigrant forebears found them less than true. Your name, like mine, rang with departures, roots severed, replanted here in fields of stone, less welcoming than crayons make them seem. Homelands are not acquired by pure dream. They may be stolen, and their crops denied to true owners, to slaves who tend their fruits, whose claims are honored after they have died, if ever, and whose names the years erase. How tempting now, Miss Conroy, to include, though late, their portraits in our wistful view, if only out of shame or gratitude. But let their absence say we haven't run, only crept at a slow, uneven pace toward justice. Let it say we're not yet done with your assignment, work we're pledged to do.
Thank you. It's a tall assignment, and 200 odd years has not been sufficient for us to get very far towards completing it. I have a question for you, though. In the first drawing that you made of the sole figure on the boat, is that you doing the drawing, looking at you on the boat coming?
Well, it was me on the boat with my relatives and the DR waving to me from the dock.
And then it's also you, after you've arrived, drawing the scene.
Yes, that's right.
So you've made you've now been transplanted from the, I mean, you know what I'm saying? You're in the image, but now you're making the image.
I'm making the image in which exists in my thoughts, in my memory.
Yeah.
It's a memory image made by the immigrant.
Well, you two have, within your lifetime, had that experience. You know, I'm a second generation. My grandparents were the immigrants. Mm-hmm. And so I have spent a lot of time trying to imagine what the experience that you're writing about must have been like for them. And likewise, I feel that we arrived sometime after that idyllic scene that they made you draw with the crayons, and that the American story had been started, but wasn't really that much farther along in their experience. And because I knew them, it's a very near mystery to me. So whenever I read things that you write about that, it strikes me very strongly because you're actually able to report in person what it was like. And I never asked them. I was told a lot of stories, and I've written about the stories, but I never really asked them about the moment of arrival. So that image really struck me.
Well, the moment of arrival is always a very striking moment. It's always, oh, wow. I had been to Washington, D.C. first when I was 3 and 4 and then left when I was 5. But I had not been to New York. And New York was full of noise and cars and people everywhere, and so much stuff. There was stuff all over the place. And I thought, my goodness, there's even a train that runs under the sidewalk. That is unbelievable.
Right.
I could not believe that it was there. I said to my father, what do those stairs go down to? She said, let's go down and see. This was the first day I was here. And I went up and down so many times that I wore him out because, of course, he followed me wherever I went.
Wow. When you arrived here, Anton, did you arrive in New York or different somewhere else?
Well, we flew to New York and then immediately took a plane to Boston with my parents. And, you know, my parents still live in Worcester, Massachusetts, and they have, you know, since 1996. So, yeah, I hadn't been to, you know, I didn't immediately arrive in New York. I arrived in, you know, kind of like a suburban, a city, but, you know, more of a suburban city. It was very different from Moscow. I mean, I guess the difference for me is that, you know, the first time I saw New York, I was actually surprised at how packed in everything was. You know, Manhattan is so packed in, all the buildings are close together. In Moscow, you know, I wasn't surprised at the subways, of course, because we had subways, but it was also spread out. Like I grew up in a building that had 500 something apartments, and it was the size of an entire city block. It had like a, you know, a kindergarten inside it, like, you know, a whole yard, you know, with some sports fields, or, you know, so it was just a completely different scale. I was having trouble sort of like picturing, you know, things are smaller and yet they're the same, and yet in some ways they're like more intense. So like Boston was obviously kind of felt like a smaller city, but, you know, still an impressive city. But again, things were somewhat more packed in terms of buildings. So yeah, I'm you know, one of the things about the crayons and the Halloween thing, the Halloween turkey, the smiling turkey, almost kind of makes me think of a different but somewhat related story. Like, you know, I got to the United States on Halloween on October 30th, and I did not know what Halloween was. So and the only thing that we were told, my parents and I were told, is that, well, people carve pumpkins and you see faces, and pumpkins have faces. Okay, fair enough. But then that did not explain when there were people dressed like monsters, you know, screaming out of the car windows. Why, you know, when we came to my father's job at the university, the secretary was dressed as Snow White. Everyone at CBS had long black fingernails and like really weird mascara, and was wearing weird costumes. And I just thought that is how people in the United States dressed. I had so
that's beautiful.
And we went to like look at the Hearst apartment, you know, that my parents ended up renting. You know, there was a bloody hand hanging off of a balcony.
Oh, of course.
Like, of course, by that time we were like, okay, you know, something is going on here. Okay, that's sort of, you know, I didn't think it was an actual bloody hand, but it was almost a little bit of a disappointment when November came. You know, like 4 days later, everything disappeared except for a few pumpkins, and I'm like, oh, actually, this place is not as wild and crazy as I. How
old were you? How old were you?
Well, I was 15. I was almost 16. But, you know, the line that struck me in your poem, Rhina, less welcoming, you know, fields of stone less welcoming than crayons made them seem. You know, it's almost like there is a certain, like the idea of being welcomed by something that's artificial, something that's drawn, something that's idealized because it's, you know, it's portrayed in a picture, you know, maybe by a child who has an innocence. So the idea, you know, I almost kind of felt welcomed by the monsters of Halloween, and they're proceeding to have more of a kind of, you know, day-to-day life, you know, in, you know, as November came and then December 1996, and I was like just trying to kind of figure out what was going on, like in high school and, you know, around the city of Worcester, you know, with people that we were meeting. It was kind of like, oh, you know, now this is like, I guess, the proverbial field of stone to some extent. you
Well,
know,
I always felt welcome. I felt welcome right from the beginning, but I knew because I had heard, and my father told me that not everybody was treated the same way. That people of different races, for example, had a very different kind of time in American cities. And I said that's very peculiar because I have Technicolor families. My relatives are come in all shades. And I didn't understand why that was the case, but I was 7. I was only 7, so I had a lot to learn, and I had seen very little in Washington D.C. I only spent 2 years there with them. They were on a mission with my father's uncle, who was a representative, and it was great in D.C. So I thought, well, I guess different people get different kinds of welcome because we were made to feel okay, no problem. Mm-hmm. And then I was in New York, where everybody lives. The whole world lives in New York. So my feeling was, well, everybody seems to be in one piece here. So not nicht gefällig, as they say.
Anton, have you written about that experience?
The experience of Halloween?
Yes.
Yes, I have. Although I actually wrote some poems in Russian about it, because back then I was. And then eventually I wrote about, I used some of the images, like some of the early images of things that I saw in the United States, just kind of like made their way into poems that are completely unrelated to specifically me arriving in the United States. But because they were just so implanted indelibly in memory, there was I had one poem where, like it's about this guy like that I think it's like inspired by a guy that I saw on Beacon Hill, kind of like an old guy that seemed very lonely, and like some lines were, on Halloween, a bloody hand hangs loose from the balcony above his window. He wishes his own blood were still that red. So, not me specifically, but the idea of like somebody reacting to a bloody hand, and instead of feeling horror, actually feeling envy, or feeling like there's something.
So you've used it, you processed it. But I mean, as an experience, it makes for such a great story. It seems like that's something that you've been given that the rest of us couldn't write about because we haven't been given it. So I'm glad you're making use of it, because that's something nobody but you can have.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm still processing it. I'll be processing it forever. Maybe I'll just write a whole book about it. I don't know. It's assignment. It's the assignment that's not yet done, but I'm pledged to do it.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's
very
right.
good.
Well, we all have assignments that we don't quite finish in time. That's okay.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you would be next in line, Anton, although you've already given us an indelible picture. Now, maybe we can have a poem also.
Well, so I'm going to read a poem called The Visiting Scholar, which is inspired by actually a professor I had who was, from Ukraine originally. And he told me some really startling things about just kind of the reaction of walking around Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had seen a lot of poverty after they followed the Soviet Union. A lot of people lost everything, people that were homeless, people that were unable to really take care of themselves, didn't have access to medical help, people that might have been doctors or engineers that were like out in the streets kind of abandoned. And one of the things that he told me was like, I walk around here by the Charles River and there are all these Canada geese. They're just all these geese wandering around. It's amazing to me because, like where I spent the last, 10 years, people would be catching those geese and eating them because they didn't have another way of feeding themselves. So kind of like thought, this Cambridge is the land of unafraid geese. So
yes,
this poem is kind kind of, in the persona. It's a little bit changed, and it's not completely documentary. And, I'm kind of, I'm not specifically saying like who the person is, but it's inspired largely by some of the things that he told me over time. The visiting scholar. My head snaps back at the sight of unafraid geese by the river, not getting killed. You think I'm bored? Actually, I see amputated limbs and discarded trees. Sometimes I take out my soccer ball and meditate on it, reminiscing about the times I photographed famous players before they were disappeared. I imagine my wife's naked body on the park benches. I might ask you to half undress and will be astonished by the thought that you're unlikely to die in the next 2 weeks. I can stare at shadows for hours. Only black cars fascinate me. Whenever I see my flag, I ripple with it.
That's a strong poem.
Thank you.
Yeah, you carry the you put it on your shoulders and you carry the weight of the message. I mean, it's not in your voice, but for most Americans, it's such a different way of interacting with the world that as Rhina says, it's so strong. Because it has complete authority and you know that it's real, but it's not the reality that you've lived in. And you bring it right to the reader or the listener so that he can't squirm away from it. And you do that, you're going to do that again in some of the other poems you read, but it's certainly one of your great strengths because somebody has to bear witness. Yeah, of course, I come from a different direction. So I will let you carry that weight. It isn't mine. Mine is not so heavy. It's not heavy at all, really. So I'm going to read a poem called "The Ghost of Easter's Past," and sometimes, as writers, we make an exercise and a habit of going back and re-experiencing things that we have experienced in our lives. But with the rise of modern technology, of course, we can record everything, and that is a kind of an aid to the memory, although it often misleads. But back 40 odd years ago, I had an idea that all of the people in my family would someday be gone. And I wanted to try to capture them as they were and not give them the opportunity to prepare themselves for posterity, so to speak. So I hid a tape recorder under the table at a big family dinner, and I didn't tell them. And but what the poem really is about, as you'll see as we get into it, it isn't just about them, but it's called "The Ghost of Easter's Past." The table is the same. My parents' plates and silverware as well, brought from their house after they died. The empty dinner chairs surround me on 3 sides. Set out before me, made by my own hands, this Easter dinner. A rib roast, mushroom caps and gravy, green glistening asparagus beneath the scattering of slivered almonds. Browned potatoes with their darkened edges, all delicious from the surety of skill developed in the careful years I've lived alone. A German chocolate cake I've baked awaits, its coconut and pecan frosting ready to dress the single piece I'll serve myself tonight. The rest spread piecemeal later. I play for the occasion a recording I made in secret at our Easter dinner in '79. The family was large then, boisterous, alive. The extra leaves were added to my parents' dinner table, and all the relatives had come to share the afternoon procession of the feast my mother hurled for proof of love and power. Knowing, as they did not, of the recorder hidden beneath the window seat, I spoke hardly at all throughout, and hours passed as human chamber music, intimate, dramatic, unimagined by Beethoven or Janáček, was scrawled across the wall of the holiday, all caught by the machine. Now, from home theater speakers in the basement, the distant voices of that day rise up. The twisting open stairwell lets them reach me. The floor ensures a separation. All the characters joined in the riot of parts below have passed away. A form of resurrection lets them speak again from memory, and only I remain to listen to and to extend our story.
It's interesting that you don't say anything about the conversation itself.
That would be more than a poem. Every single, maybe everyone's family is like this, but every single one of my father's brothers and his sister were astonishing characters. Most of them great storytellers, all of them big and blustery and ignorant. I don't know how to. Dostoevsky could do a great job of writing a chapter about that dinner.
You know,
I am not.
It could almost be. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to hear what you were going to say.
It could almost be the first poem or the introductory poem to a book of poems in which everything is like an imagined or remembered or an extension of that dinner conversation where, you know, you just introduced all the characters and then you have like, you know, it wouldn't necessarily even be the dinner, but the story that's being extended. You know, first we meet these characters in this setup, and then you just go off into the whole world. But the thing that I think it's an absolutely remarkable poem, and what is astonishing to me about it is that it is so universal by kind of stepping back a little bit. And not only do you refrain from editorializing and from kind of saying, you know, beside basically saying to listen to and to extend our story, which is a little bit of an abstraction, everything is just reporting. You know, you're reporting on the tables, your cooking skills, the German chocolate, kind of like a sense of loneliness there. You're like, you know, now you're the only one remaining there. And then you just kind of like matter of fact recount this really surprising situation that almost would be science fiction if it weren't real. And it could become a science fiction if like somehow people came alive or something. But you don't go into any of those directions. You just very calmly and in this patient way and very accurate way report on something that is so evocative and so profound that, you know, like my imagination fills in the conversation and everything that happened in the years between that recording and when you're playing it back. And it's just a whole world. So in a way, even though it could be a great introductory poem for like a collection of poems about your family and everything that happened, simultaneously, it also works so well by itself and
Yes.
almost like becomes kind of about every family. And it
Yes.
acquires this universality by, not having too many personal details, like about
Well, yeah, thank you. And I'm going to use that explanation if anybody besides Rhina ever asks me why I didn't tell anybody what was said at the dinner table that night. Because I agree, it is better. It's better letting the listener imagine. But I will just tell you one thing to flesh out the claims I made for my family. One of the people that was at that dinner that I did not write about and have not yet written about, but I will tell this story, was my Uncle Felix, who was 4F during World War II. And he owned a bar in the downtown of the city where I wasn't born yet, but where my father's family lived. And during the war, and they lived on the hill where the Italian immigrants lived. And so he would have to walk down the hill to go to the bar every morning. And he had a pet duck that he kept on a leash.
Wow.
And he would walk down the hill with the pet duck and go into his bar and set himself up behind the bar and put the duck on the bar and put out a little dish and put beer in it. And during the day, the duck would drink the beer and get drunk and wobble around on the bar. And that was like the show. Everybody would come in to watch the duck. So how could I tell that and not tell about all of them, Rhina? I ask you.
No, you can't. It can't be done. Can't be done. You win. The tale of the drunken duck.
So what can I say? That's what they were like. Well, thank you.
In this day and age, you could have had a YouTube channel and could be like 14 million subscribers and just like have the duck
It's true.
live streamed every day.
Exactly right. Well, that's a little piece of reality that would not still exist in the world if I didn't occasionally tell it. So thank you for giving me an excuse to tell it. Okay, round 3.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's slightly different. We're not having drunken ducks here. This is my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, who had lived a rough life. And I sat down at once and sort of remembered her life and thought, how do people come through this kind of difficulty? She was widowed twice. She had lost her first husband and the children from that marriage, together with some kind of pandemic that went over the country like the COVID. And then she married the man who, of course, became my grandfather, and had a difficult life. Butchering, it's called. My mother's mother, toughened by the farm, hardened by infants' burials, used a knife and swung an axe as if her woman's arm wielded a man's hard will. Inured to life and death alike, "What ails you now?" she'd say ungently to the sick. She fed them too, roughly but well, and took the blood away and washed the dead if there was that to do. She told us children how the cows could sense when their own calves were marked for butchering, and how they lowed, their wordless eloquence impossible to still with anything, sweet clover or her unremitting care. She told it simply, but she faltered there.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a person that I have never been able to forget, or never been able to get over the kind of life that she had to live.
Mm. Well, that's another case of bearing witness.
Yeah.
These things are so important. It's so important to bear witness to the realities.
Yes.
because everything isn't now and the way things are now.
No. She was very, very quiet. She spoke very little. When you got something out of her, it was a treasure. Because she was busy all the time. Sometimes I think she kept busy on purpose.
Now, how old were you when she was around? Until what age for you was she alive?
She was alive until 1951 or something, 50 or 51. But of course, I stopped seeing her when I was 7 years old in 1939. So we had a relationship only by mail. I wrote her, and she would, write me back and so on. But it was distant.
When she wrote to you, was she any more expressive than she was in person?
No, she was very tight-lipped. She did not like to spill much.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Unlike my other grandmother, who invented stories and who knew all the poetry. She was the one who was a poet. The other grandmother, my father's mother, played the guitar and was always doing something with friends, and she was the one with the melopillas and things like that, and gardening. Everything she did, she loved. But my mother's mother was silent.
Mm-hmm.
So you come by it honestly. You had poetry in your past.
Oh, yes. It was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother was the one who had the friends gather in her living room, and some would play the guitar and the violin, and she played the piano, and she also played guitar. And they had these poetry meetings, and I didn't know what the grown-ups were doing. And I said to her once, what is it? What are you guys up to? What is happening here? And she told me, well, this is poetry, and we're enjoying it. And I thought, well, that's wonderful. I made up my mind that when I was 4 years old, that's what I wanted to do.
That's terrific.
So I used to tell her, write this down for me. And she would write down the things that I said, that I said were poetry. And it's just as well that the whole thing disappeared, because I'm sure they were awful, but it was fun to do.
It must have been fun for her to have you want her to do that for you.
Oh, yes. I was the first grandchild, and I think of all the people in my life, she's the one who had the greatest influence.
Wow. Should we press on?
Yeah, I'm faltering in commenting on this poem, except to say, it made such an impression on me when I heard you read it. The first time I heard you read it was at Newburyport Literary Festival, and I went home and I wrote a poem in response to it, which unfortunately, because I sent in my poems earlier, is not part of my 5 selected poems. Although I kind of wish I could switch, but I don't want to mess with the rules of the game.
You can switch if you have it with you. Go ahead and switch.
I have it. Yeah.
Everything is permitted. Everything is permitted.
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely. I mean, it was a poem that was inspired by the experience of hearing Rhina's poem. I talk about, I was sort of like thinking back to people that I actually met that I knew who were telling me some stories about calves and butchering and cows, and like some of their dark realities of having a farm, which is what they do, which is what they have, and kind of like it resonated so much that I think the poem, Rhina's poem, resonated with my memories of those people that I met, some years prior. So so this poem, which was written later the day I heard Rhina's poem, is called Past Fireflies. At dusk, they break to touch each other's hair, a lifetime's worth of lore in a mild smile. They make their way past fireflies, up the stair. Their flannel shirts rest in a vibrant pile. This afternoon she killed a month-old calf. Tomorrow he will drive its severed thighs to nearby markets, sold for less than half the steakhouse price, while blood on haystacks dries, and lightly syncopated ding-ding-dings of phones deliver news from city friends. Gunpoint compassion, tingling boxing rings of culture war, systemic self-defense. As years swerve past, few friends will drive 4 hours to traipse their verdant paths, to taste their brie, to make like Wyeth models in soft flowers and eavesdrop on their evening vis-a-vis. Only the record player will spin and spin Leonard Cohen by the warm red stove, as pairs of vultures roost on trucks to sting the eye with unapologetic love.
That's so
Oh.
moving. That is so moving.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I was kind of thinking that, I was simultaneously shocked by kind of like just the daily realities of like, they have the scabs and there's a lot of butchering going on at times.
Yeah.
And it's gruesome and it's something that's tough to talk about. And yet at the same time, they had all of this, like, they had the record player, they had the, like I kind of like accidentally eavesdropped on kind of like them having like a very intimate kind of conversation in the kitchen and, just like, being like this sense of coziness at the same time, and yet like it's coexisting with some fairly gruesome realities of the, that are kind of also necessary for the life that they live.
This is one of the things about poetry that is priceless, that it allows you not only to open yourself because you write the poem, and that means you're opening to the reader, to the whoever picks up your work, but you're also taking advantage of those who open to you, those who converse with you and who let you see something of their lives. You're walking right in. And I think only poetry does it to that extent. It really does. So that even the pauses in a conversation mean something. Even the change of expression. If you're one of those noisy kids, those people notice expressions. They notice voice changes. They notice silences, and that's poetry. That's the value of it. Thank you for. May I have a copy of that poem, please?
Oh, yeah, of course. I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Please.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for changing direction. That was these things come to us, and to take it off the flow is a great thing that we can do, because as I say, we can do what we want.
Yes.
Well,
so
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just there was a reading, I think, that like at Zoom reading, that I think when Rhina was featuring at Carmine Street Metrics, the first thing that she asked me is, you're not making trouble, are you? And I said, but I'm making trouble.
Well, this was no trouble. Well, you've inspired me, so I'm going to digress from my program, because we've been on the farm, and so I'm going to read a poem that was told, the gist of which was told to me by my Sicilian grandfather, who was a shepherd in Sicily and came to America in 1915. And this is a tale that he told me when I was a small boy about life when he was a small boy. And of course, Sicilians, among other things, are famous for the concept of omerta. And do you know what omerta means?
I think it means revenge, no?
No. No, that's something else.
Omerta,
Omerta,
code of silence.
yes,
like a secrecy.
exactly, exactly. You see that Sicily has been overrun and ruled by so many different nations and principalities that the native people there have learned to keep a low profile and keep their own counsel. And so they do have a code of secrecy. Well, so my grandfather, I didn't know any of that when he was telling me the story because I was just a boy. But this poem is called How I Learned About Omerta. One day, a big stone came down from the mountain. It rolled into the one road in the village and stopped right in the middle of the street. It was so big, the wagons with the cheese all made a line and couldn't get around it. What did the people do? My nunnu smiled. He finished with a swallow the last inch of homemade muscatel left in his glass and placed it back down on the kitchen table. I thought a while and said, they dragged it off? It was too big. The shekudedus couldn't pull it, he said, and grinned. I was expected to keep on answering. They broke it up, I said. My kid's brow creased from heavy thinking. It was too hard. The hammers only bounced off and the sparks jumped, but it wouldn't break, he said, and watched me carefully. I said, did they put water on it? And at night, after it froze, the ice in any cracks expanded and it split apart in pieces? There was a wrinkle in his brow. It was too smooth, he said, and smiled and shook his head. But that's a good guess. You know what they did? I give up, I said, and sat up straight. They buried it, he said, and gave me time to think about what kind of stone he meant.
I think I get it.
So,
Yeah.
this
I have to
is
tell
why
you, I loved Sicily when I was there. I loved Sicily.
I meant to go. I meant to go. I was in Italy in 1972, and I had plans to go to Sicily, and I got distracted in Rome and never got any further south. And but I would like to go back. And we still have relatives there. Not that I could speak to them in Italian, but they still live there. But this is where my love of mystery and wisdom came from.
I love the act of like finishing the wine and setting it down in a very kind of measured sort of way before proceeding with the, before answering the question, proceeding with the story.
Yes,
storytelling.
No hurry. He knew how to do it. So even though he could barely speak English, but he made himself understood. I've given him more clarity of speech than he actually had, but no more clarity than I was able to perceive. I knew what he was saying.